When the Red Army stormed into Berlin in April 1945, it was the culmination of a brutal 4-year war on the Eastern Front. Soviet soldiers hoisted their red banner over the Reichstag, a powerful symbol of victory. Having captured the capital of the Third Reich at an immense cost, you'd think the Soviets would never let it go. And yet, just a few months later, they willingly handed over half of the city to their Western allies, the Americans, the British, and the French. Why? Why would Stalin, a leader known for his ruthless grip on power, give away such a prize? The answer is a fascinating mix of strategic calculation and a complete underestimation of his allies' resolve. Let's rewind to the final stages of the war. Even before the fighting ended, the Allied leaders, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, had been meeting to decide the fate of post-war Europe. At the Yalta conference in February 1945, they confirmed an earlier agreement. Germany would be divided into 4 occupation zones, one for each of the major Allied powers. But what about Berlin? The city was located deep inside the Soviet-designated zone, over 100 miles from the nearest Western-controlled territory. Logically, it should have been entirely under Soviet control. However, Berlin wasn't just any city. It was the capital, the symbolic heart of the defeated German Empire. For the Americans and the British, having a presence there was non-negotiable. It was a matter of prestige and a signal that Germany's defeat was a joint effort. Stalin, surprisingly, agreed. He consented to divide Berlin into 4 sectors, creating a small western island in a vast Soviet sea. So, why did Stalin make this concession? It wasn't out of kindness. At that time, in mid-1945, the war in Europe was over, but the war in the Pacific was still raging. The Soviet Union hadn't yet declared war on Japan, and the United States desperately wanted their help. The Americans were planning an invasion of the Japanese home islands, which was expected to cost hundreds of thousands of American lives. Bringing the massive Red Army into the fight would significantly speed up Japan's defeat and save Allied soldiers. Stalin knew he held a strong card. In exchange for joining the war against Japan, he secured significant territorial gains in Asia, like the Kuril Islands and South. Agreeing to share Berlin seemed like a small price to pay for these strategic acquisitions and for maintaining the goodwill of his allies, which he still needed. There was another, more ideological reason for Stalin's decision. He didn't believe the division of Germany and Berlin would last forever. His long-term vision was for a unified, demilitarized, and neutral Germany. A Germany that he hoped would eventually fall under Soviet influence and become a communist state. Stalin believed that capitalism was inherently unstable and that the working class of a post-war Germany, disillusioned and impoverished, would naturally turn to communism. By allowing the Western powers a small, isolated foothold in Berlin, he might have seen it as a temporary inconvenience. In his mind, it was a gesture of cooperation that would eventually be meaningless when the entire country realigned with the Soviet bloc. He was playing the long game, or so he thought. Furthermore, Stalin likely saw a tactical advantage in the arrangement. West Berlin was completely surrounded by Soviet-controlled territory. It had no direct land connection to the western zones of Germany. All road, rail, and canal access had to pass through Soviet-occupied land. This gave him immense leverage. He probably thought that if the Western powers ever became too troublesome, he could simply squeeze their little enclave in Berlin and force them to bend to his will. It was like having a hostage. He could cut off supplies, block transportation, and make their position untenable whenever he chose. The Western presence in Berlin seemed fragile, a strategic liability for them and a powerful tool for him. He believed he could isolate and neutralize them at any moment. But history rarely follows a neat script. The post-war cooperation between the Soviet Union and the West quickly soured. The Grand Alliance fractured, and the Cold War began. The ideological divide between communism and capitalism became a gaping chasm. Germany, instead of unifying, became the front line of this new conflict. In 1948, the Western Allies decided to unite their occupation zones and introduce a new currency, the Deutschmark, to help rebuild the German economy. Stalin saw this as a direct threat. It was a clear step towards creating a separate, pro-Western German state, dashing his hopes of a unified, Soviet-friendly Germany He decided it was time to use that leverage he thought he had. It was time to squeeze West Berlin. In June 1948, Stalin ordered a complete blockade of all land and water routes into West Berlin. The roads were closed, the railways were cut, and the canals were blocked. The 2 million inhabitants of West Berlin were suddenly cut off from food, fuel, and all essential supplies. Stalin's goal was clear: to starve the city into submission and force the Western powers to abandon their sectors, leaving all of Berlin to the Soviets. He expected them to pack up and leave within weeks. It was here that Stalin made his first catastrophic miscalculation. He severely underestimated the determination of the United States and Great Britain. Abandoning West Berlin was not an option. It would have been a humiliating defeat, a signal to the world that they would not stand up to Soviet aggression. The Western response was something Stalin never anticipated: the Berlin airlift. In one of the most remarkable logistical feats in history, the US and British air forces began flying supplies into the city. Day and night, for nearly a year, planes landed at Tempelhof Ghetto and Tegel airports, bringing everything from food and coal to medicine and candy for the children. At the peak of the airlift, the plane was landing in Berlin almost every minute. The operation, codenamed Vitals by the Americans and plain fare by the British, kept the city alive. The people of West Berlin, who just a few years earlier had been the enemy, were now symbols of freedom, heroically resisting Soviet pressure with Western help. The airlift turned the tables on Stalin. His blockade, intended to showcase Soviet power, instead became a global spectacle of American and British resolve and ingenuity. It was a massive propaganda victory for the West. By May 1949, Stalin had to admit defeat. The blockade was a failure. It hadn't forced the West out. It had only solidified their commitment and led to the creation of a formal military alliance against the Soviet Union, NATO. Stalin quietly lifted the blockade. He had realized his mistake. The Western presence in Berlin was no longer just a symbolic remnant of Germany's defeat. It had transformed into a powerful symbol of the West's commitment to defending freedom against Soviet expansionism. West Berlin became a beacon of liberty, shining deep inside the communist bloc. It was a window into the prosperous, democratic West, a constant and embarrassing reminder to East Germans of what they were missing. The Berlin issue didn't go away. In 1958, a new Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, decided to try again. He was frustrated by the constant stream of skilled workers and intellectuals fleeing from East Germany to the West through the open border in Berlin. This brain drain was crippling the East German economy, so Khrushchev issued an ultimatum. He gave the Western powers 6 months to withdraw their troops from West Berlin and agreed to its new status as a free, demilitarized city. If they refused, he threatened to sign a separate peace treaty with East Germany and hand over control of all access routes to Berlin to the East German government. This was a thinly veiled threat to start another blockade. But this time the West would have to deal with the East Germans, whom they didn't even recognize as a legitimate government. But the world had changed since 1948. Both the US and the Soviet Union were now nuclear powers. President Eisenhower flatly rejected Khrushchev's ultimatum. The crisis dragged on, leading to tense summits and a military buildup. But the West stood firm. They would not be bullied out of Berlin. Khrushchev eventually had to back down from his ultimatum, another sign that the Soviets had lost control of the situation. Unable to force the West out, the Soviets and their East German allies resorted to a more desperate measure. In August 1961, they began constructing the Berlin Wall, a physical barrier of concrete and barbed wire that would seal off West Berlin and finally stop the flow of refugees. The wall was a brutal solution and a glaring admission of failure. It was an ideological disaster, a prison wall built not to keep enemies out, but to lock their own people in. So, looking back, Stalin's decision to share Berlin was one of the greatest strategic blunders of the Cold War. He thought he was making a clever, temporary concession to gain advantages elsewhere. He believed he held all the cards, that he could easily push the West out whenever he wanted, but he failed to grasp a fundamental truth: symbols matter. For the West, staying in Berlin became a test of credibility they could not afford to fail. His actions, from the blockade to the wall, only strengthened Western resolve and exposed the moral and economic bankruptcy of the communist system he was trying to build. The small island of West Berlin which he had so casually agreed to create, became a persistent thorn in the side of the Soviet Empire for over 40 years, a constant symbol of defiance until the very end of the Cold War. It was a mistake that haunted his successors and contributed, in its own way, to the eventual collapse of the very system he fought so hard to expand. Thank you for watching. If you found this piece of history as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next video. See you next time.